Dark matter comes out of the necessity for gravity to explain everything in these dynamics. But if there's some other actor, if these things are bound to one another in ways that we don't yet understand, maybe there's a material basis for that, where we're looking in the wrong tunnel for the answer.
Well, you are right that it's possible if each star has an Oort cloud, and indeed those are touching each other, just like billiard balls that are densely packed. And there is a lot of exchange of materials, but they are not rigid objects. They are very rarefied, because the distances between the rocks are far greater than their size. So most of it is empty space, and Oort clouds can pass through each other without a problem. But it's true that many of the objects that may exist in the Oort cloud may have been borrowed from neighboring stars. And especially if the sun was born in a cluster of stars. And so there might be a lot of interstellar material trapped in the Oort cloud. And, it's just like families living in a commune. Sometimes you don't know who are the parents, It
took me a second to process. That's quite the analogy.
But in the context of dark matter, that's a more serious issue, because there are two possibilities. Either there is another substance, matter, that is not interacting with light, and that's the origin of the idea of dark matter. We just don't know what this matter is. It could be primordial black holes, for example. Then you would never see them, because they are tiny and they exert only gravitational force. They don't interact with anything we know. The second possibility is that gravity is modified, and that is not at all being followed. This idea is pursued by a very small fringe of the academic community, and to me, it's not at all clear.
Is this the MOND?
MOND, exactly. And it was suggested 40 years ago, and the data on the dynamics of stars in galaxies is very well fit by this theory. It's quite remarkable 40 years later that there is no clear deviation from the predictions of this theory in galaxies. But the one deficiency of this model, MOND, is that there is no extension of it that applies to the universe at large, that appears to be consistent with all the data we have on the universe. For example, the cosmic microwave background fluctuations, or the clustering of galaxies on large scales. Whereas the dark matter hypothesis is able to unify the large and the small. It's quite possible that we simply don't have the right ideas about how to generalize MOND from the scale of galaxies to the scale of the universe. It's quite possible, because to me it's still quite remarkable that it works on galaxy scales. And of course I was familiar with MOND since I worked in astrophysics for 35 years. 5 years after MOND was invented, I entered astrophysics, and I knew the person who invented it, Mordechai Milgrom, and followed it over the years. And I still regard it as an amazing success story in the context of galaxies, but not in a larger context. One way to test MOND that I thought about just this year, and when I mentioned it to Milgrom, he never thought about it, is the following. Basically, what MOND says is that when an object is accelerated at a very low acceleration, it responds to forces much more strongly. So actually, it's the acceleration squared that is proportional to the force at low accelerations, rather than the acceleration being proportional to the force as Newton imagined. That's why it's modified Newtonian dynamics. And what I argued is, if you imagine a rocket, in the context of Newton, a rocket needs to carry a huge amount of fuel in order to accelerate to a speed that is beyond the exhaust speed of the gas that is being shot out from the back of the rocket. So that's why basically the amount of mass that it needs to carry grows exponentially with the terminal speed of the rocket. So that's why you see these rockets with a huge fuel reservoir, and all of the spacecraft that we ever launched to space never exceeded 1 part in 10,000 of the speed of light. So they can't go beyond that, because the amount of fuel that you need to attach to them to start with is exponentially larger if you just want to get a small increment in their terminal speed. So in the context of MON, that's not the case. In fact, you can imagine a rocket that carries in fuel as much mass as it has in its payload, not exponentially large. But then the fuel is burnt very slowly, and it pushes the rocket with a very small acceleration below the threshold of Mond. And if it does it for a very long time, let's say 1 billion years or billions of years, then the rocket can even reach the speed of light. If it does it for long enough time at a small acceleration, simply because you get much more than you pay for, in a way, because the acceleration squared is proportional to the force. And the force is simply the momentum given by pushing material out of the rocket that is pushing it forward. So it turns out that in the context of MON, you can get to very high speeds with very little fuel. You just need to be patient because it takes a long time.
That's a multi-generational experiment there.
And Milgram didn't think about it. I just thought about it by one of these pandemic days that nobody was knocking on my door, so I could think about it.
I guess that what I'm curious about is if anyone is considering non-gravitational cohesion mechanisms by which stars could stick to one another, is there any kind of stickiness that anyone is,
No, that's not... okay, we know from cosmology that, I mean, if you forget about MON and modified gravity, if you just imagine standard gravity, we know that the amount of ordinary matter that was in the early universe when hydrogen, so remember, in the first 3 minutes of the universe, the temperature was so high and the density was so high that hydrogen protons basically fused to make helium. And that is the origin of the helium we see in the sun. Most of it was made in the Big Bang. And in any star, about a quarter of the mass was made in the hot and dense 3 minutes after the Big Bang. Okay? So we can infer the amount of ordinary matter that existed in the universe per unit volume, and then compare it to how much dark matter you need to explain the motion in galaxies or the cosmological expansion. And you find that there is just not enough in ordinary matter based on the abundance of helium relative to hydrogen.
So this is based on like expansion dynamics, essentially?
Yeah. So if you use Einstein's theory of gravity, you can figure out, you can go back in time. The universe was hotter and denser because we measure the temperature today of the cosmic microwave background, so we know what the temperature was as the universe, as you go back in time. And you can calculate how much helium would be produced in the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, and you find that it matches what we see if the amount of ordinary matter is about a factor of 6 smaller than the amount of dark matter.
Well, it also depends on the interpretation of the CMB being correct, right?
Right. No, so all of that is in the framework of Einstein's gravity. So then there is no doubt as to how you should extrapolate back in time. Of course, if gravity is modified, you have to worry about how to extrapolate back in time, and then you may avoid this constraint that I was mentioning.
I mean, something that was really... So we were talking a while ago to John Moffat from the Perimeter Institute, and he has this variable speed of light theory, and we were really trying to dig into the new James Webb data, because it was just after the really high redshifts were coming out, and we were kind of picking on him a little bit, and we were asking if anyone was studying different explanations for redshift. And we came up against the fact that there is a really stiff wall where he was like, no, we don't study that. This is a given. It's almost a philosophical question of other possible explanations because it's so far outside the realm of what is considered possible or probable or likely that there's no one sitting around. You know, there's like Halton Arp who's like, hey, I have an atlas of anomalous galaxies. I think that stuff is weird. And then you run across people that are kind of on the fringe that are like, hey, something's weird. But it's really strange to me that at the heart of the academy, the place where there should be a plurality of theories, even about these really, really fundamental things, it seems like there's just one voice that has agreed that we don't work on that.